Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can find and subscribe to this podcast via Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our site, vmspod.com, to find more information, as well as our RSS feed, which you can plug into any podcatcher so you never miss an episode of the Virtual Memories Show. You can also follow me on Blue Sky, Instagram, and YouTube, where I go by vmspod, and subscribe to my semi-weekly newsletter at buttondown.com/vmspod. Well, I have been running around to keep an eye on my old man in the hospital the last couple of days, which accounts for why this episode is a day late and why this intro is going to be kind of brief because I have to head back out there. It is the first time he's been admitted in more than 4 years, so that's a good thing. The last time was late December 2020 before we had vaccines, and there was this moment when I realized I might not see this guy again when he went through the doors, but here we are. Anyway, it's just, I've been spending a lot of time just sitting in these like overheated observation rooms and waiting on tests that keep getting postponed. And I would say he's not in any danger, but I mean, you know, he's going to be 88 in a few weeks and never really took care of himself. So, you know, danger is a relative term. Not life-threatening is all I'm getting at. Anyway, that'll be my afternoon. That's my business. Along with trying to stay on top of the Washington chaos because of my day job. But anyway, this podcast is what keeps me alive. So let's get to it. And my guest this week is the cartoonist Matt Madden, who has a great new book out now from Uncivilized Books, 6 Treasures of the Spiral, Comics Formed Under Pressure. 6 Treasures collects more than 20 of Matt's comics over a couple of decades. And what makes them special is Matt's focus on using a formal constraint for each story. And we'll talk about what that entails in the conversation. But the gist is he takes these challenges like using a poetic form like the sestina or composing a lengthy story that can be read as a palindrome forwards and backwards, and other challenges, we'll put it that way. So each piece has a rule of sorts that Matt adheres to, and a lot of them come from a sort of literary background or literary foundation, and he's adapting that challenge itself into the comics form, which is something. And the thing is, well, all of that can lead to like just sort of cold formal trickery. We talk about that, like Nabokov's take on this stuff, how it's not just it's not the author trying to mess with the reader, but something more, something special. Matt manages to like tell stories that are full of feeling and tension throughout. They're not just there in service of whatever the challenge is, but he takes the challenge as a way of telling a really engaging story each time. And it's sort of amazing to watch it at work. I'd say watch him, but you're really watching the mechanism of storytelling take place over the course of these pages. And the book also includes some back matter. He describes it as like the director's cut, where he talks through the process of making some of the stories and how he approached the constraint and what went into designing the pages and sort of understanding how to get it across to the reader what was going on without making that solely the goal of the story. And ultimately, you start to see how he found freedom in the various constraints that he assigns himself for these things. So 6 Treasures of the Spiral, it's a blast. You don't have to be a cartooning maniac to dig these. The stories themselves are generally pretty accessible. It's just that when you add the layer of storytelling constraint that goes to it, you know, it makes this collection even more special. And his cartooning is top notch. And well, any comics reader is going to pick up on any story aficionado is going to pick up on how having rules in place can really lead you into some some great creative spaces. So the book itself is a really neat companion to Matt's 2021 full-length graphic novel, Ex Libris, which is also out from Uncivilized. And we did a remote podcast around that one, so I was glad to drive down to Philadelphia and do this one in person. Anyway, I got to head back to the hospital. So here is Matt's bio. Matt Madden is a cartoonist, educator, and translator. His best-known book is 99 Ways to Tell a Story, Exercises in Style, a comics adaptation of Raymond Queneau's Exercises in Style. His recent work includes the comic books Drawn Onward and Bridge and the graphic novel Ex Libris. He has been living in Philadelphia since 2016. And now, the 2025 Virtual Memories Conversation with Matt Madden. So tell me about bringing the collection together.
This collection has a long kind of backstory to it, and I think its current final version is actually the best version it could have been. So I'm glad it actually took a while, and it goes back to even when I first went to France in 2012, and I was doing this residency at the Maison des Auteurs. And as part of the application, they ask you to, pitch a project that you're going to work on. And this was basically my project, was to gather up my short experimental comics and pitch a collection of them, and maybe draw a few new stories. And it was a shorter collection. I had just finished Drawn Onward, the palindrome story, or the Crab Cannon comic. And it was a decent collection, but it wasn't as fleshed out as it could be. And I shopped it around a bit to both, L'Association, my French publisher, and the usual suspects in the U.S., and no one was buying it. So I kind of put it aside and started, working on other stuff, and eventually settled on doing Ex Libris, which ended up being the next book. Yeah. And that actually was great because it gave me more time to think about the collection, and crucially, during that same period, I drew Bridge, the 24-hour comic that I do while I was in France, in 2016, and then redrew a couple years later. I guess it was 2013 that I did the 24-hour comic session, and then 2016, my last year in France, I redrew it and make it look the nice looking thing it is now, because the original one was pretty sloppy.
24 hours being 24 hours.
Yeah, I mean, some people, if you're Louis Trondheim or Tom Hart, you can make a 24-hour comic that kind of looks like your usual stuff because of your own drawing style and your own proficiency, and just like your intuitiveness, and be able to just like lay something out that looks nice. And in my case, I've done 3 24-hour comics now, 2 of which are finished and published. But I really had to, especially with Bridge, I was really happy with the story. I think it's one of the strongest stories I've written, but the original art was definitely not very presentable. So, although I redrew it practically just like composition for composition. It worked well enough the first time that the story was completely in place. I didn't change anything about the dialogue, maybe a few slight line tweaks. The compositions are basically in place. I fine-tuned a little bit when I redrew it, but it was really just I'm just not fast enough as a drawer to make it look good that fast. But everything else about it was remarkable how well it came. It was one of those kind of magical moments of walking. What the whole kind of ideal goal of a 24-hour comic, where you show up with just a blank, mind and blank sheets of paper, and you come out of it with a wonderful, 24-page story. So. That ended up being the linchpin of the book for me, and that's why we used the art from that on the cover. For a while, I was going to name the collection Bridge and Other Stories and really foreground that. But the closer we came to publication, talking it over with Tom Kaczynski, my publisher, and with Jessica, Abel, my wife, and a few other friends, I realized that it was it's not a very compelling cover to call something Bridge. It just doesn't really evoke anything. So I went back to my original title for the book, which was Six Treasures of the Spiral, which is the name of an earlier comic in the collection that really has a kind of, sort of grabs you in a number of ways. Yeah. And also hints at the content a little bit, and the idea that there's some kind of that there's numbers involved and spirals and shapes. It suggests that there's some kind of playful, formalistic kind of stuff going on. So I like that about it as well.
And your subtitle.
And the subtitle, which, pressure. Yeah. I mean, selling a short story collection is always a challenge. Selling it to a publisher and then the publisher selling it to readers, which I just find it weird because anyone who likes comics or literature, everyone likes short stories. We all love one-page comics. We all read, Borges and Raymond Carver and, Flannery O'Connor or whoever it is. So I don't understand why it's still in the publishing world such an anathema to dare to try to publish a short story collection. And then there was another consideration for me, which is that, these are, there is a through line to these stories, even though they're very all over the place in terms of subject matter and drawing style, but they're all kind of experiments with using constraints that I've been learning about and inventing and exploring for the last 20 years since doing my 99 Ways to Tell a Story exercise in style. So I discovered Raymond Queneau, and that led me to Oulipo, the workshop for potential literature, and this whole idea of creating art by setting yourself a rule to follow that's usually pretty weird and unexpected, like writing a text without the letter E, for example.
It's always the example I use when I try and explain.
It's a book with the letter E. And it's also, I will say, it's a great one to try yourself. Like I always usually follow up by saying, try writing, just write like a short, like a paragraph about yourself, a little, story of your life without using a letter E or another vowel. Or a letter from your name. I have a little sketch that I should get back to and finish up with a little story of my childhood without using the letter M. So I can't, obviously I can't use my name, but I also can't say me. I can't say mom. There's all these things I can't do. So it's really, it's a rewarding challenge. So everything in this book is created using one of these constraints, including a 24-hour comic. And it's cool that, comics has this sort of history, whether it's explicit or not, of experimentation and playful challenges and stuff like that. So Scott McCloud created a 24-hour comic in 1990, and I'm pretty sure he'd never heard of Oulipo and wasn't really thinking about, French experimental literature when he came up with that. It was just Steve Bissette had a sort of creative block, I got an idea, do 24 pages in 24 hours and take it to the print shop, and that'll be our, get us out of our funk, which it did. So when it comes to collecting all this stuff, I had to face the question of all right, do I just sort of put this out here as a short story collection and without any further comment and let people read it and make of it what they will? Because I do intend for these stories to stand alone as fiction, as, literary comics, as pop comics, depending on, the story. Yeah. Without needing to know anything more about than just whether you enjoy it or not. But at the same time, it feels a bit coy not to point out that there is this,
the rule behind each one of them,
every single one. And because I have a background as a teacher, Jessica and I wrote 2 textbooks, and I still do a lot of teaching online. And I've been doing comics coaching for a few years now, so it's definitely it makes sense to make that part of the package. And I also am a bit of evangelical for the power of constraints as a teaching tool and a way of thinking about creativity and a way of creating art of any sort. So
we talked a little about that 3 years ago. We recorded. It was a remote session, which when I listened to it on the drive down here, I was surprised. I was like, we really sound like we're in the room together. It actually had that vibe. But, at the time you mentioned Calvino and If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler being a sort of entry point for you for that world, and something that informed Ex Libris, certainly. What was the overall, discovery of Oulipo and then the bande dessinée version that you are the U.S. ambassador for?
It's funny. The more I kind of look at older work and sort of try to contextualize it in as I do new stuff. I sometimes will discover some obvious thing, kind of benchmark early on in my career or life that I hadn't really appreciated its influence. And so, in terms of drawing and art and my whole approach to laying out and drawing comics, before Crazy Cat, before Julie Doucet and Dan Clowes and Carol Swain and all the people that got me really excited in the 90s, I realized when I had several years after I'd finished drawing the story Six Treasures of the Spiral, I was looking at the art and realized, oh my God, this is like Hergé all over this thing. I even studied some Tintin panels
afterwards.
Yeah, it really didn't. I mean, I even swiped some drawings of boats for the sort of background stuff. And of course, there's a character called Sixto, who's basically like a sort of little Latino Tintin kid with the black, spiky hair and everything. But the line weight, I misdirected myself because I was trying to, because it's a maritime story set at sea. I was looking at Alex Raymond and some of the old what's the underwater comic thing facing on the newspaper strip?
It's a letter and a number. I'm
no, not the Secret Agent one. The
okay, I was thinking X9 or something.
X9. But anyway, that sort of there's a style of maybe it's Flash Gordon I'm thinking of. I think it's just the Flash Gordon comics that have this sort of wonderful swoopy line art to suggest this kind of like gauzy underwater. So I try to imitate that in a fairly clunky way, and it works for my style. But I don't think anyone looked at oh, you're looking at studying the master inksman. But so I think that also kind of like took my attention off, and it really wasn't until later I was like, oh, obviously Hergé is like foundational, and then now I see it in all my stuff that it's like.
I thought in particular that one going in, I thought, okay, well this is his Hergé tribute. Okay,
that's funny. That wasn't explicitly what I was doing, but clearly it was. So.
It's there. It had the McCloud style from Understanding Comics and Zod in particular too. So which is an interesting fusion to make. But
in terms of in a similar way, putting this collection together, obviously, if you know my work at all, you know that I did this 99 Ways to Tell a Story, Exercise in Style, which is an adaptation of a book by Raymond Queneau called Exercise in Style, where he does one story 99 different ways and different styles, different points of view. And so that was my starting point as coming into my own as a particular type of experimental artist, and identifying myself with using constraints and rules as a way to generate stories. But it does go further back than that. And of course, there's Calvino and Borges that I studied in college. And Calvino is a big influence. Both those authors were a big influence on Ex Libris, as well as a third artist who's author, Julio Cortázar, the Argentinian writer. And when I was putting this book together, I decided to include a short story of his called The Continuity of Parks, which I adapted to comics years ago. And it's one that I've always been really fond of, and I have redrawn it. I think this is like the third version of it, that I'm finding. And I'm still, whatever, I'm happy with it. But that story, though, it dates to my very first semester, not of college, but my first semester at University of Michigan, when I had switched from linguistics to comparative literature. So I was taking an intro survey to comparative literature, and one of the first things we read was a bunch of Cortázar short stories. We read the story that Blow Up, the movie is based on, and watched the movie, and we read Axolotl, and we read The Continuity of Parks, which is just this amazing kind of little jewel of a puzzle story. And I'm writing, and this sort of connects to the structure of the book too. So like when the book, all these stories have some kind of constraint or rule behind them. And so one question that I was facing collecting this stuff is, do I say like, have a sort of title page for each story with like, this story uses say palindrome constraint and I have a diagram. And that felt like too intrusive. Then I didn't want it to actually, I want it to be useful for teachers and artists, but I also don't want it to actually look like a textbook, So I came up with a solution of having a back matter and thinking of it more like an index or like a kind of director's commentary section.
I think it works great in that way. So.
Thanks. And so it was an opportunity for some of these stories I hadn't really thought about for a long time to be like, to sort of elucidate, like, what is actually the constraint here? Because like continuity of parks is more of a rhetorical kind of fabulous trick where it's sort of a looping story that eats its own tail in some way, like a Ouroboros, but it's, and there is a term that I decided to use, which is metalepsis, which we probably talked about ex libris, because that's really what that's about, is like slippage from one layer of fiction to another. But as I was saying, well, what more can I say about this story? Which, and by the way, I had to reach out to Cortázar's estate and get, so this is a officially licensed production of the story, which I'm very proud to be able to do. And, I don't know that, Cortázar died in the early 80s, I think, and I'm not even sure if his widow is still around, so I don't know if there's anyone who would see it, but over the years I've gotten friendly with Oulipo members, and they were big fans and friends of Cortázar's, and invited him to join Oulipo, which he declined because he was too into just political engagement at that point in the early 80s before he died. But they actually presented my story did like a Cortázar anniversary, like his 100-year birthday anniversary, I guess, in France a few years ago. And I wasn't able to go, but I sent them this story and they projected it and talked about it. So that was very cool. But as I was thinking about that story and looking at it and thinking about where it fits in my timeline as an artist, I realized that not only is that story one of the most crystallized moments of being really excited by the magic of the labyrinth of storytelling, of the way that stories can be a kind of puzzle that's a sort of, like Nabokov describes it, writing as a kind of game not between the characters on the page, but between the reader and the author, know. And I love that idea. And I think of it as a very participatory, playful thing, and not a sort of talking down to the reader kind of thing, which I think some people maybe interpret it that way. But I realized that not only was that a story that really solidified that tendency that I like in art, but it really was the story that more than any other made me think, I want to do this. And so it was really a moment of realization that that story, which I read, it would have been, 1988, as I was an undergrad. If I can trace back my interest in being an artist and storyteller, that's almost as good a place to start as any. And it sort of coincides with me discovering in indie comics and the sort of Crazy Cat and Winsor McKay reprints and Raw and all that stuff that was coming out at the same time in the late 80s. And then discovering the world of mini comics and realizing, I can just do this and go to Kinko's and
which again for you and me was the golden age, as we know. Yeah. Everybody has a golden age, of course, but we have
my generation's golden age for sure.
Were there other, I'll say, realizations you had looking at the past work, or even sequencing what you had there and trying to figure out, how to put it all together for a reader? I realized, or I would say, further appreciate, because I'm always aware of this, the eclecticism of my interests and styles. There's the variety of types of stories that I'm telling, and which makes it very hard to sort of sequence together. Like, I went through various versions of the book, putting all the short story comics in one section and having all the short, long ones together. I ended up doing a bit of a compromise. Like, there's a section that has a bunch of the 2-page and 1-page stories kind of clumped together to just sort of have a rhythm to it. But there were also formal considerations, printing considerations. Like, I have first of all, the Drawn Onward, which is a sort of palindrome symmetrical story, which has a pretty important centerfold where you're supposed to be able to open it up. So I had to have that, if not right in the middle,
pretty close to the middle. And we did end up sequencing it so that if you, not that I suggest you breaking the spine of your copy.
I was very careful when I was reading it.
But it is actually laid out so that it's right on the middle of a signature, which is to say that middle image is just two figures kissing and their lips meet right in the joint of the book. You can actually open it up if you were to want to pull that out and get an extra copy to make a pen-up out of. You could pull that out and it would be a single image. There's also, and to Tom's credit, there's about 8 pages of color, which is pretty annoying for a publisher to have to shell out for like a couple signatures of color. And so, and my first thought was like, well, listen, we can just do one signature. It could fit in one signature. You only pay for that one shot. But he's like, no, I think we should spread out the haiku comics in particular, which are colored, and have like at least 2 sections. So we sort of, again, it was a question of mapping out. I do think it was actually one signature, but sort of spread out.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's 2 signatures, but you had to have all the color fall in these 2 signatures that are sort of on either side of the book. And again, those are the kinds of constraints that I'm always talking about that are less a constraint in the sense of write a text without E, but the everyday constraints and parameters that we're always working with as artists. It's just to say, if you're a new color, it's got to be within these 16-page signatures, and they need to go to a certain place in the book. If you're going to have, if you want something to open all the way, you've got to make sure that's right in that page 7 and 8 or 8 and 9 of that in the middle of that signature. And that goes in a certain place of the book, and that starts to put sort of weight on where anything else can go. So that was actually helpful for me, I think, to start piecing the rest of the stories and trying to find a balance between
constraints in the overall layout.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So that was actually helpful. And beyond that, it was just very intuitive, just trying to move from have a balance of shorter, longer stories, a kind of tonal movement from, I would say there's a general movement of a little bit more serious and even melancholy stuff in the beginning. There's like Prisoner of Zembla and Hiram for Hantum, which are Hantum for Hiram, and drawn onward even, and Bridge. Actually, all those stories are fairly tragic in one way or another. And then you get into the kind of horny section in the middle with the Elemental Force and Fuck Me, the 2-pager I did for Dirty Stories all those years ago. Again, that's sort of a experimental constrained comic I did before I really knew that was there was a name for that. Yeah. And I was really happy with how it ends out, because he ends up with like a Rondo's Coat, which is a sort of kind of a trifle, but one of the earliest stories in there, but one that I'm very fond of. And then I end with a story called The Others. That's kind of an observational piece, but also has a bit of that Cortázar kind of Ouroboros kind of thing, where the narrators are kind of nesting into each other. And I thought that was a really nice way to ease out of the book. So
I would say you can compare it to Slackers too, but once again, as most of our conversation goes, it's dating us.
Exactly.
When we mention any of those things. So
I think I did mention Slackers in the back matter of that one, actually.
Do you tempted to redraw anything else besides Bridge and the Cortázar piece?
I mean, I don't intend to, but I was just...
in the process when you were putting it together, was it geez, I really should redraw X, Y, or Z?
Well, the haiku are redrawn because those were originally done as quick, just like pen on copy paper studies. Mm-hmm. And there was an argument to leave them that way. They're okay, and maybe I should print those at some point as a kind of companion piece. But even if it was like in contradiction to the evanescent spirit of a haiku, that being something gestural and very quick, to then go and spend several days inking it carefully and then doing and doing ink wash and color and cutting in Photoshop. I felt like it was worth it to create a final result. I think the results are still have that peaceful, quick gestural haiku feel. So those were redrawn. I'm trying to think. I'm sorry if there's page flipping sounds here, but I'm trying to remember.
No, that's the ambiance.
There were, and actually that's in one interesting thing I think, sort of, that I talk about in the back matter is the story called Elemental Force, which was first published in a thing called Hotwire Hotwire comics that Glenn Head.
I was going to say Glenn Head was
edited back in a long time ago. I did like 2 issues or something like that, and it's one of my most convoluted, constrained thing. I was trying to use a kind of graph type of constraint that's a simplified version of what George Perec used to structure his novel Life, a User's Manual, which is one of the high points of Oulipian writing. It's called the I have to look up the name because I've forgotten again already, but it's also often misspoken. 3x3 Greco-Latin square. So it's this kind of like, it's basically like a Sudoku kind of thing where you take elements and you mix them up. Anyway, the original version was 6 pages because it was like corresponding to the grid, and it was just very predetermined by this constraint. And I ended up with a story that I was kind of happy with, but it was a little, the version was printed in Hotwire. I've always felt it was a little too straitjacketed. So I was like, it needs a bit of breathing room. And of course, with comics, you can't just cross out a sentence and write something new. You have to there's these constraints, the more, higher level or maybe lower level sort of basic layout constraints. So you can't just take a panel out. If you take a panel out, you got to reflow everything or you got to replace it with something new. So, and I have a little diagram in the book where I talk about this, but I thought if I could just add one more page and just like smooth out some of the stuff that feels, especially the latter part of the story, I think I could, sacrifice a bit of the original tight constraint in the name of having a story that flows better. And it was a really interesting challenge. And then also drawing new panels that would still look like something I drew 15 years ago.
Trying to keep the style down. Yeah.
Which I think I managed to pull off. I think it's actually pretty seamless in the end. And some of it's even drawn on Procreate. I did a couple of, digital inking things in there at the last minute. And I think it's fairly seamless in the end. So there are some earlier stories that I didn't put in there, partly just because I think the art is just like too early. Early. Yeah. That's a nice way of putting it. Yeah.
But yeah. It's been about 3 years since we last spoke. What did you learn from Ex Libris? From publication, from finishing it, from leading into collecting your short work? How have you changed over 3 years?
I learned a lot, I think. In the process of finishing it, and it's being published and the reception it got, which was very good. I learned that, sometimes a project that you have kicking around, you think like, I don't know if this is really worth doing, because the idea for Ex Libris dates back to the mid '90s. I have. I just, for the exhibit at Philly Comics Now, I pulled out a bunch of working papers and I found an outline which has the basic bullet points of the story from 2006. But I think the original idea is even, several years before that. And I always felt like, well, it's a little arch, doing this story, from a first person point of view. And there are all kinds of, it's very, it seemed maybe a little bit too overly experimental and in a kind of coy way that people wouldn't like. And maybe I wouldn't even like. But it kept on coming back to me and like, no, but I do like this idea, though. I think it's got legs. And so committing to finally doing it and realizing like, oh, yeah, wait, this actually, holds water. And starting to show it people and, just friends would come to visit my studio in France, which is where I did the bulk of the drawing. And they would just they would see one of those pages on the wall, like, what's going on here? It's such really intriguing, So I realized I was onto something there too. And then finding, Tom Kaczynski I've known for years, and I've always thought he'd be a good publisher, and at various times I've even sent him stuff, and just like we've had sort of ships passing and that kind of thing where like we've never really connected. And I finally got Ex Libris in front of him in 2020 during the lockdown. And he's like, oh, this looks great. I should publish this. And I was like, yeah, you should.
Yeah, what an idea.
And working with him was great. And I feel like I found a home with him that I've been looking for to have like a sort of base of operations where we get along very well and we're very simpatico artistically, and I feel like I can pitch stuff to him, and I like having that, one-to-one relationship with the publisher. And a collaborator, especially with the design and layout of the book. He's really had he designed the whole cover for Six Treasures of the Spiral, which has been getting a lot of good reaction to. And the Ex Libris cover was very much collaboration between the two of us. So that's all been great. And then the book comes out, and it's a hardcover, full color, experimental comic by Oversized, by a small American publisher. And, and it didn't make any, best of the year list or anything like that. It was, it's very much lives in its own kind of sphere. And yet, it's gotten almost universally good reviews. I got trashed by the Comics Journal, but that's a sort of tradition with me and most artists, I think. But pretty much virtually every other review I've seen has either been like, this is really interesting, or like very favorable. And we sold out the first print run. We have the last few, so I actually, earned some royalties on an independent,
a novelty in the
experimental
comics world.
Comic book, which is pretty awesome. And so we're reprinting it this spring. Well, spring of 2025. And so that'll give us an opportunity to kind of read. And now that Six Treasures is out too, that gives some good synergy there to kind of have them help each other out. And that was the other even kind of higher level change for me. And really, it was a strategy. It was what I was hoping would happen was that, and we probably talked about this last time, that, throughout the 99 Ways to Tell a Story came out in 2005, a long time ago. And that's got a big anniversary coming up in the coming years. But as soon as that book came out, Jessica and I were already married. We had our daughter 2 years later, our son a few years after that. We were teaching at SVA. We started working on the 2 textbooks that we did together, which came out of the 99 Ways to Tell a Story. Our agent, Bob Mikoy, when he was showing that around, he talked to a lot of people who were like, well, this book's a bit too experimental, but if you get this guy to do a how to make comics book, I'd be interested. And it was an opportunity we couldn't really turn down, even though I didn't feel ready to really necessarily write a whole, devote 5 year, which ended up being like a 6 or 7 year project, because we ended up splitting into the 2 books, Drawing Words and Writing Pictures, and Mastering Comics. We took on the Best American Comics series as series editors for 6 years. So at a certain point, I started to drown under all this comics related but non-comics stuff that I was doing. And
Did you feel like you were doing that deliberately?
Sorry?
Do you feel like you were doing that as a way of avoiding the comics work?
No, absolutely not. No,
Okay.
I felt
not to psychologize here, but
I know.
As someone who takes out a lot of things to keep himself from doing the thing he's meant to do.
Yeah, maybe there's an element of that in I think about that these days, where like I'm a stay-at-home parent, and so like, since we got to France, Jessica got much more serious about basically supporting the family, and has been just working really hard basically, and started her own company, Autonomous Creative, where she's been doing these online coaching and doing coaching for creatives and doing different kinds of course programs. And it's been great, and it's been able to support the family and have me not have to worry about making a living wage. I make some money from my comics, my translation, and so on, but really my job is to run the household, take care of the kids, and find time to work on my comics, which is great. And I do now. My kids are, and when the kids were younger, that really was like a full-time thing. So when they're in France, I was walking into the school and doing errands and doing all kinds of parental stuff. But now my kids are 14 and 17, and they're pretty much able to take care of themselves.
They don't want you around.
And so I do. At this point in my life, I do start to realize, like, all right, I haven't drawn comics in 2 weeks. So have I really not been able to make time, or am I kind of avoiding the work it takes to get into it. But no, in that era, really, I would say in the 2000s, I was really eager to make comics. I was really excited about working with constraints, and I did. A bunch of the stories that are in this collection, I should say, were drawn.
Sure.
I wasn't totally inactive, but I was able to do short stories for different anthologies. The bulk of the stuff in this collection were drawn in that period between 2005 and 2016. But I definitely felt very stymied by the fact that it was a scarcity thing. Like we have 2 kids now. We have to we were living in Brooklyn. You gotta be able to pay the mortgage and all this stuff. So no, we were just like taking on all the work we could, and taking on, teaching adjunct. I mean, school visual arts treated us very well. Actually, had a really good experience teaching there. But it's still, at a structural level, you're teaching adjunct, and there's very little security to it.
Sure. Yeah.
We get insurance coverage, which again, that alone is a reason that you kind of have to do it when you're an artist. I yearned for just having time to just work on comics. And so going to France on we ended up in 2012 applying to the residency de Maison d'Auteur in Angoulême, and then things got complicated because actually Louis Trondheim, who I've known for a long time, his daughter actually came and au paired for us this summer before we went to France, hoping that she would get our kids speaking French. But of course, she just wanted to speak English and hang out in Brooklyn. But so at the end of that summer, right before we moved to Angoulême, Louis and his wife Brigitte came and had dinner with us. And at one point, he said, "All right, so now you're going to France and you've got the residency. There's nothing to stop you from making comics now. What are you going to do?" And of course, the first year, I was definitely residencies, even a long one like that. It's always hard to not squander time, fiddling with your studio, getting it set up just right. And I did have plenty of good excuses to not work. We're like, well, I got to go figure out this paperwork for our health insurance in France, and I got to get my working papers in order, and our apartment isn't set up yet. So I definitely
there's legit excuses, and then there's
a combination of legit excuses. But definitely, at a certain point, I definitely could see all right, there's just some avoidance here of just sitting down and getting to work, and the same. And I will say the same kind of scarcity thing where every kind of opportunity I had to do a workshop at some school somewhere halfway across France, I'd be like, sure, I'll do it for 200 euros or whatever, and a free train ticket. Partly because it's fun, but it's not really. It's not good for the creative momentum and kind of mood. So it wasn't until I really got deeply into Ex Libris, which is really late 2014, I would say, towards the end of our stay there, that I was really able to formulate a rhythm of just being all right, every morning I'm going to go at least draw for a few hours before getting sucked into all of the everyday stuff that happens there.
Now, I will say, when we talked last, you'd mentioned Trondheim in the context of challenging you to do a project, a book-length project especially, without the constraints.
Yeah.
And any progress, or are you still in the, well, maybe someday, Louis, I'll get to that.
Not really, no. I mean,
okay.
I'm working on two new projects sort of in tandem, and the one of them is not entirely constraint based, in the sense that it's sort of I'm still kind of deciding how it's going to be structured, but it's basically kind of more of a farcical adventure, almost like a Scooby and the Gang kind of story of a bunch of cartoonists trying to chase down the Rarebit Fiend, sort of taking the idea of Winsor McKay's the title, The Dreams of the Rarebit Fiend, as if the Rarebit Fiend was some kind of monster that existed out there in the dream world or something. And so that's a story that I've decided to just start drawing it. I've got a page on the drawing board right here now. Again, just getting back into the habit of drawing stuff, posting it online and sharing it without really committing to whether this is even going to be a book yet at this point. So it's much more loosely structured in that sense than my stuff usually is. But it still has plenty of constraints in that now I'm trying to kind of evoke Winsor McKay's art without doing it in a sort of total pastiche of his style, but using elements of his layouts and his drawing style and the economy of his art, and the trying to wrestle with the constraint of the dream structure. I don't want to do a whole book where every page ends with someone waking up in bed. So how do I use that as a kind of productive structural constraint? So it's still plenty constrained. And then the other one I'm working on is an Uber ubapo constrained thing where I won't even, it'll take too long to get into. We'll save that for the next interview. Hopefully I'll be further along in that one.
Although I did want to ask, one of the things that occurred to me between this, the back matter where you go into some of the, how the constraints work out, as well as some of the things in your Substack, which I'll get into after. What ubapo, well, you're dealing with graphic grammar and verbal grammar, where the Ulipo world is essentially the language. Mm-hmm. You've got to, in the process of doing this, you're adding 2 to 3 more layers of challenges. Not to say that this is much more difficult than doing a novel without the letter E, but there has to be a whole, there are multiple languages at play, basically, that you're building, that you're using those constraints within, or that those things are constraining you with. Did you think about that before you fell into this whole world of
I mean, yes and no.
French people seem so smart.
Like a 3D chess aspect to it. But
like with the sestinas, you're there's the language and there's the panel structure, and as you've mentioned in one of the Substacks, you have somebody else's example where they're using the color as a repeating sestina motif, I guess. Right. That all gets beyond just use those same 3 words at the end of 3 lines, and or 6 and 6, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's what for whatever reason, it's what got me jazzed about actually being an artist was the thing that comics does of combining all that stuff together, and the richness of that interplay between text and image and layout. And I really feel like it's time for, when people talk about comics, we talk about text and image. And I think when image, they mean the entire visual aspect of it. But for me, the drawing aspect, the representational aspect, is very different from the design aspect. Page layout, panel borders, page turn, using the book as a form of storytelling. So I really think of comics being those 3 elements, and I say that a lot. I mean, even back to talking about Exercise and Style when that came out, is a lot of those exercises are based on using that 8-panel, layout that I used for the original template story and flipping it upside down or turning it into a grid or turning it into, 30 panels or 1 panel. That is a really important part of comic. What makes comics appealing to me. But yeah, it does mean that you're juggling. I'm not a graphic designer. I'm not a terribly good artist. Like I've sort of pushed my way through, just like every and comics, I think art in general is a way to teach yourself stuff. So I think a lot of people, writing a novel for the first time, or learning how to make a film, or writing a song on a guitar, part of it is like as you're doing it, you're learning new skills. So if I want to have a bridge that's going to be in this weird scale, I got to learn this scale and go study this, these modes or whatever. So I'm comfortable with that, and I'd like to see people start dropping the whole imposter syndrome idea. It's become a kind of like really common. Easy. Like everyone's Of course, there are very few people who can actually say like, well, I have the PhD in this and I can prove that I have the certification, to do X activity. Like, no, you're always saying, I'm going to do this because I want to, and I think that's fine. And I would have never become a cartoonist or an artist of any sort, I think, if I had let that sense of, I'm not really qualified, I don't actually know what I'm doing yet, stop me from just starting to make mini comics, which is why our generation, the whole zine culture that we had back then, was so great, because it was just such a welcoming and forgiving and accessible way to work. Of course, now we have the internet, but that's all. It's a different angle, because that's even more broadcast. Like the zine culture was like a very cloistered kind of scene back in the. It was a subculture, but
it was a culture.
Yeah,
it did have a
it had a culture
to it.
Yeah. But although I will say along those lines that there is, to me, I think, a lot of truth to what the famous formulation of Rudolf Topfer had this sort of disclaimer where he's like, well, I'm not a very good writer, but I have I have a knack for doing doodles. And he's like, well, I'm not a good artist, but people say I have a way of words, you know? Yeah. So there is that sense of having some pretty decent writing and some pretty good art, but you put them together and it can create something that's
it's alchemy.
Alchemy, exactly.
Yeah. And like you say, you say you're not a graphic designer, but everything you're doing involves a degree of that construction and understanding what impact everything has. To that extent, how much prep goes in before you're on the page? How much writing, structural thinking, graphing things out, etc., generally before you're actually drawing?
A lot. The thing I do least, I would say, is like writing. In terms of like writing a script, I've never written a full script for a comic.
Okay.
I'll usually have ideas for, with all the stories in Six Treasures of the Spiral and Ex Libris, and the majority of my work at this point starts from a concept, from a kind of formal constraint or conceit that I find that it's intriguing to me. So like, what would it be like to take the Sistina, this medieval French poetry form, and use it as its weird repetition and permutations of repeating elements? How would I use that as a way to make a comic? And that's where it starts. And then it becomes a matter of starting to make diagrams of like panel layouts and like which panels would repeat. And there are so many ways you could do it. Like the Sistina is a really rich structure. There's two different versions of a Sistina in this book. And I would love to do, that's something I'd like to do like on a book length version, figure out how I'd do like sort of chapters that have repeating elements, the way the Sistina repeats these 6 elements, like the 6 treasures of the spiral of the title. So to take that story as an example, the 6 treasures of the spiral, or A Prisoner of Zembla, similarly, which is an alphabetical constraint where every panel kind of mimics the corresponding letter of the alphabet. Once I started from that concept, then it became a matter of just like doodling a bunch and trying to think about how would you lay this out in a page? Would it be, how many panels per page, and where would how would the letters get worked in, or how is the repeating panels gonna work? And then a lot of sketching of what the characters would look like, letter forms, and how they would make faces or bodies or different objects and stuff. And slowly, and then as I do that doodling, ideas come to me. I mean, doodling is a great way to generate ideas too. So with the Sistina, drawing this spiral a lot, which is has a relationship to how you understand the Sistina structure in the poetry form that I found in like a poetry handbook. That got me thinking about like, oh, well, obviously like Madness and the Tintin, curlicue kind of spiral stuff, but also thinking about whirlpools, and that led to, you could also think about like a Milky Way or like a solar system. It would be another way to think about it. So that got me in the direction of like, okay, maybe I could do something like an adaptation of Poe's Descent into the Maelstrom, which is a short story about a ship crew that goes down this giant whirlpool. And that didn't work out, but I liked that. I stuck with that idea. So I kept that, and then I started working on the characters. So at this point, not really thinking about dialogue, not really thinking about the overall plot, just trying to like put all these pieces in. And then at some point I end up with a kind of armature that's like half full of stuff that the constraint is calling for. And that's where the writing and the story part comes in. Then I start to see like, oh, I'm starting to see a pattern here. These two characters have some kind of relationship that I see developing just the way they're drawn and the way they appear on the page. And that's giving me an idea of like something that's happening between them. And that's where the story comes up. And what's cool about that is that it means that I'm often completely surprised by the stories that I tell. They don't really come out of some preconceived notion or a story I read somewhere else or even something from my life. It comes out of wrestling with what the constraint demands. But I find that the best of my stories, which are the ones that are collected in this book, they find a way to draw in fairly, classic narrative and kind of even psychological character elements through the structure of these constraints that give it a kind of freshness and lack of cliche that I don't think I could necessarily come up with just on just writing a story. Like there's a story called Pantu for Hiram, which is kind of loosely about one of my grandmothers. And it never occurred to me to write a story about my grandmother, but something about the structure started making me thinking about putting me in mind of this anecdote about my grandmother, when she was leaving her apartment, being taken to a nursing home, and how she got very disoriented and bewildered, And, I think it's a very sweet little sad story, and it does actually play directly into my family history in a way that I find very satisfying. Because I'm not really a memoir autobiography cartoonist, but I like it when I can find stuff from my own life that sort of seeps its way into these stories through these structures. That's what's appealing to me as a storyteller is finding the way these constraints and structures will like draw stories out of me that sort of come out of a combination of my personal experience, the kind of other fiction and comics that I've read that are going to inform the stories I like to tell, and put them in some novel combination that is kind of required by the constraint. And then it's up to me to just and I become more like an editor. And I'm like, all right, well, this is good, but what if I just refine this and smooth this part out? Then then these characters will have this satisfying arc within this very, formally constrained structure.
Use other tools like, oblique strategies, things along those lines? Or is it pretty much, when you found a concept and you've got the drawing set up?
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, I love Brian Eno. He's one of my heroes. And I've always been fascinated by oblique strategies. And the I Ching too, but I find
they seem to be they seem to be contraindicated to your storytelling mode. But
in that they're more aleatory, I guess. But I don't think they're necessarily contradictory. Like I could be working on a constrained story and I get stuck in any part of it, something about how the story works, or some question of like how many pages it's going to be, or like, some formal element. And there's no reason I can't just pull out an oblique strategy and it'll say, do it all backwards, because sometimes they are new constraints to throw into the mix. And I think that's totally legit. But for whatever reason, the few times that I've tried to do that to get unstuck, there's never been, I can't point to a moment where I was like, oh, this is where the strategy out and it, gave me an idea. So, and I'm not sure why that is, because you're right that they are different systems of problem solving in some ways. The idea of pulling something at random, or doing the I Ching. But like I think about John, like I'm a big fan of John Cage and his thoughts about art and creativity. And while he's very much into indeterminacy and chance operations, the level of meticulousness you need to create a system like he does that will generate a piece of music or an exhibit of art, you have to the questions you ask to set up these operations to generate interesting results actually require a lot of forethought and planning and work. So in that sense, like Cage's operations in particular are very compatible with like Oulipo and working with constraints, even if at a certain level, Oulipo has described itself as anti-chance. It's all about creating a structure that will lead not to an inevitable result, but you're wrestling against a concrete, some kind of structure that you need to work around, a block in the road ahead of you that you need to slalom around, and it's not just sort of pulling random stuff out of a box and, but I do think these systems are more related than they sometimes seem. I'm trying to think though, if there are other tools I've used, like when I get stuck. Like the oblique strategies, other than just traditional stuff like walking away from a while,
take a walk around the block.
Yeah, take a walk. I have a guitar here in the studio, and just sitting down and playing some guitar for a while is a great way to just like shift my creative focus elsewhere and do something else with my hands that will sort of reset me a little bit.
That's for the best. You found a set of... I certainly don't want to derail you from the process that's gotten you this far.
Yeah. That's just an interesting question. I'm trying to think of other, like I would say, too, that the stories in this collection, mostly they are stories. Some of them are more experimental than others, but I find myself in a bit of a in-between position in regards to like avant-garde and high literature and pop culture, and I'm sort of like somewhere right in the middle of all that stuff, where I love avant-garde practices, and obviously that's what I've devoted myself to as a creator. But my final results tend to be pretty accessible, and in fact, a lot of the stories in this collection you can read as straight short stories without having any sense that there's a constraint going on. And a bunch of them I've sort of test run that way, where I've shown them to people over the years, and even just in interviews it comes up where people haven't realized or don't care that there's a constraint there. They just like the story. So that I guess that is one sort of like countervailing pressure on my work in that sense. Not a pressure, but a source of inspiration, where I'm like taking these constraints. And you could certainly, like abstract comics has never appealed to me greatly. Like I've done a little bit, and I'm working on some stuff now that I might publish at some point. But ultimately, I do like something with a story. Like I'm a great
human
lover.
Connection. Yeah.
Sorry,
a human connection to things.
A human connection, and the magic and engagement of watching a few characters go through a situation and come to some kind of conclusion is very satisfying, and I think that's fine. I think it's part of, and I think you can undercut that a little bit. Like I'm suspicious of traditional narratives in a lot of ways, but at the same time I employ them. So, I think in some ways you working with constraints brings attention in an almost like Brechtian way to this sort of artifice, where you're sort of aware, like, oh, this is someone, there's someone pulling the strings literally here, moving stuff around. And yet, there's a story that I'm connecting with in there. And I find that's an interesting tension, to be able to create something that is kind of self-critical and self-aware, but that also, and maybe partly because of that, allows you to enter into the world even more fully sometimes, and go along with the world that's created in there.
It's sort of the vibe I get when occasionally a guest will tell me after, I forgot we were on mic. Mm-hmm. Where there's that sense where the conversation itself, beyond the parameters of these two giant microphones and everything else sitting here, people can just get lost in occasionally. But tell me about the Substack thing. What you've gained from what you're doing with Substack and what it's helped you with in the process of making it. We can say newsletter if you don't want to say Substack because of the whole Nazi issue.
I will say Substack specifically because I've had a newsletter, like a MailChimp newsletter, for years. Yeah. But I didn't really use it as a newsletter. I used it as a newsletter, I should say. I got a new book coming out. I'm going to do an event here. Here's a review of my new book. And I started the Substack because I thought, especially as I was putting the book together and working on this back matter, like a lot of people aren't going to see this book, and there's also more stuff that I want to say about these constraints and other constraints that aren't in this book that I want to talk about. And I enjoyed blogging back when that was more of a thing. Back in the 2000s, up through the time I was in France, I was blogging pretty regularly. So Substack seems to me like a way to combine the newsletter and the blogging aspect, where I definitely use it to promote the book, and when I have when this goes live, I'll put it on my Substack newsletter, and it'll be in my email newsletter, but it'll also be on the Substack app. And what's nice about the app is that, or the platform, is that it has a bit more of a social media type of structure where you can share stuff, you can restack things, people can follow you from the Substack who don't because I've sort of reached my limit. I've got a pretty decent mailing list that I've collected over the years, and most people I know at this point. Like I'm not regularly getting new followers to my mailing list when I do events and stuff. So the Substack is a great public place for people to find this stuff, and it appeals to me because and I didn't do a lot of research. I just it was more of a kind of inkling I had. It seems like Substack. I mainly knew about it as a journalist place where journalists were publishing stuff. And I started looking at it and like, oh, there's a lot of creative writers like Juno Diaz and Alexander Chee and a bunch of authors are on there sharing their thoughts and advice and about writing. And and one, as a teacher and as an educator, I really feel like the stuff I'm talking about, my comics, applies more generally to all kinds of art. And I want to Substack seemed like a place that could reach a larger audience like that of people who aren't necessarily just in the comic scene or already into Ubipo or Ubapo. And so I've been using it as a way to partly just directly copy some of the stuff from the back of the book and share it as posts, but I can expand it a bit more, add a few more illustrations and a few more anecdotes, which promotes the book, but also shares these ideas out there. Do stuff like I'm not going to do a newsletter, like just a list of 3 things I've been into lately. That could be like music or film or whatever. Although I've been doing less of that because it ends up that, every little thing like that adds another, because you do newsletters, like, you always have like long lists of.
I'm used to Porcelino having 2 pages of that in an issue of King
exactly,
Cat. So.
Yeah. It's actually a lot of work. Even you think, oh, that'd be fun, just like share the stuff I like. No, I got to
run you into the
capsule.
ground.
Do I just put the link, or do I need to describe it? So I've actually been doing less of that and just concentrating on sharing my own resources and thoughts. So like I did, my most popular post was kind of like happenstance, where as part of this Philly Comics Now exhibit that we just did here at Drexel University, I was asked to do a couple of workshops using book forms because the Drexel art program is very sort of applied arts and graphic design oriented. So I remembered this activity I hadn't done for years called a foldy comic, where it's a little mini comic made with a single sheet of paper, folded up 4 times. So it makes a little booklet. And it's a very simple thing, requires no stapling, no cutting or anything. And it works great with the students. And then I was like, oh, this would be I could do a Substack about this. And Jessica and I, when we all had a blog many years ago for drawing words and writing pictures, which is still online. You can still find it, but I don't find that people use it very often. So I repurposed that original blog post and expanded it. I did new diagrams that I thought worked better to sort of explain the structure. Made a PDF that you can download, of the handout. And it's the kind of thing that it's a constraint, as far as I know, created by this cartoonist named Keenan Rubenstein, who appears to have moved on from the comics world, but he made a bunch of them in the mid 2000s, I guess, that I discovered and started. I only ever made a couple myself, but I started using it in my teaching quite a bit because it teaches you about storytelling, but again, the book form, because you're talking about unfolding and changing the orientation, and even like printing them out is a pain in the ass to get it to like line up just right. So it's a great teaching tool, and I think they make really fun little booklets. So that on Substack has really taken off for some reason. Like people, a couple of people shared it who have like more followers, and that was really nice. But it's really, I can see people like sharing it, and saying, I'm going to try this. Looks really fun, So I like being able to share stuff. I mean, all the stuff I'm doing, I always have like here's how you do this kind of thing. So even something more complicated like the Sistina comic, I'll try and lay it out in a way that if someone's interested, they can give it a try or, give them some resources. So, I've gotten new subscribers from directly within Substack and from getting recommendations from other people there. Got some paid subscriptions, not, enough to like sort of a nice pat on the back kind of thing, more than making it,
pizza money.
Pizza money, yeah.
Although price of pizza nowadays.
I've taught and coached a bunch in the last few years with a bunch of great people who always want to keep on talking about this stuff, especially working with constraints. So like with my paid subscription, I do like a monthly Zoom call. It's pretty informal, but we just, normally we'll talk whatever constraint, like the Foldy comics, I'll say, hey, anyone want to try a Foldy comic, bring it to the Zoom meeting and we'll talk about it and you can hold it up or whatever. So that part hasn't taken off the way it might, but I'm also worried, once I get above a certain number of people, it's going to get kind of unwieldy to manage too. So
watch out for success.
Yeah. So as it is, it's sort of my, nearest and dearest, like a bunch of friends and students I've had over the years in different classes who have stuck with me and really enjoy just getting together to talk about this stuff. And that's been a rewarding way to, and again, making it part of the paid subscription I can justify like that, like spending an hour a month on Zoom, chatting with people that I like about stuff that I love. That's great. I enjoy doing that.
But the community building aspect is getting back to the blog era, really. I mean, it's the whole newsletter thing for all of us is we used to have communities and now we're all isolated and need to figure out how to, not just for the sake of selling things, but, being able to reconnect.
Right, because my other main platform, only platform really is Instagram. And that feels much more like a broadcasting thing. Like I'm just, and it often, and I, again, the whole algorithm thing, which I don't bother even trying to learn what's going on there, but I definitely notice that it tends to be the same 20 to 50 people that like all my posts, and it's like I'm very much a very small. You don't show up in mine.
When I was looking, when I was doing this thing, I'm like, oh, apparently I've been following Matt this whole time on Instagram. I don't remember seeing anything of his in the last year, but whatever. That's how those systems work, because they're just trying to keep us engaged in whatever they think our interest is. The last question, which I hit you with 3 years ago unexpectedly, and I hope you remember this is coming. What have you been reading?
I've been reading a lot of comics. I'm trying to catch, the end of the year, catch up all the books I've read over the year, or what books I bought or acquired over the last year. But if I'm going to recommend one book, I've been reading some poetry, and one that I really like. I'll pull it up here.
Sure.
Actually, I'll mention two. One is this book, My Life, and there's a sort of a second version called My Life in the 90s by Lynn Haginian. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of like, have you ever read I Remember, the Joe Brainerd book? So that's another great book that's, Joe Brainerd did this starting in the late 60s and kind of through the 70s, where it was, again, sort of a proto-Oulipian memoir. And Georges Perec actually took the structure and made his own version, called Je me souviens, which is also really famous in France. And it's a way of writing memoir, again, that sort of gets around, like, well, I was born here and I did this. And it just consists, it's just a writing exercise, basically, where every sentence starts, I remember. Mm-hmm. And he would just, like, have lists of these things. And there are several different iterations of the book, too. And they range from, he grew up in Oklahoma in the 40s and 50s. And he's like, I remember when margarine came in a white block with yellow food coloring powder that you would mix in, stuff like that. I remember the first time I got picked up in a men's bathroom, and when I first moved to New York in 1960, whatever. So it's like this, full range of experience in American life. It's really wonderful. So My Life by Lynn Haginian is a similar type of thing where when she turned 37, she wrote 37 short texts. Each of them are 37 words long. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the structure that she set herself. And within that, she basically does a kind of memoir, but it's disjointed. They're just like, it seems like she was kind of like, I remember style writing lists of memories, or maybe looking through old diaries, or, some of it feels like borrowed text from other books. And then she arranges them in a block of text with no indentation or no paragraph breaks, according to the word count. So there's a bit of a aleatory, constrained kind of aspect to it. And they're very difficult to read. Like I'll read one and then put it down for a few days, but it's thoroughly magical. The effect of it. So that one's really worth checking out. And the other one is even more difficult, challenging book, but very rewarding. Is Dictée, the French word for dictation, by Teresa Hak-kyung Cha. She's a Korean-American writer and filmmaker who died in the 70s, very young. And this book, Dictée, is a highly, I wouldn't quite call it Oulipian, but it's a very formally structured book where each chapter is named after one of the muses and one of the Greek art, like Aristotelian art forms, the comedy, tragedy, lyric poetry, and so on. And then the texts are sort of prose poetry very abstract, almost like Gertrude Stein or Samuel Beckett, kind of like a lot of repetition, and you're always getting lost as you're reading it. But as you immerse yourself in it, you start to realize that she's talking a lot about her experience as a Korean immigrant, and especially her parents' generation having fled the Japanese and Korea and ending up living in China for a long time before making it to the U.S. And the sort of multiple traumas that invokes in her and in her family and in the cultural timeline. There's like maps and old photos and pages of her handwriting and stuff. So it's a book that I've been slowly. It's my cafe book. I have it in my book. So every time I go to a cafe, I'll read like one section and just really try and focus on it, but also not try and focus it too much because it's so the language is so kind of swirling around itself that it's one of those books, like Lynn Heginian. And I guess that's something that I connect the two of them because they're both sort of contemporaries in this sort of pretty experimental avant-garde poetry, both very feminist in different ways, where the language is like almost a palpable object. So it's like you're almost running your fingers over it for the first time, like a sculpture. So I'm reading it as if like, all right, I'm going to come back to this later because it's a text there's no way you can absorb from start to finish on a first go. So I find that very rewarding. So
it doesn't make your own comics a little too difficult. I like the influences on you, and I just want to make sure, I still find your stuff accessible, I guess.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I mean, well, it's, I read stuff like this and I'm like, wow, I could really push so much further into, and I do, I really, especially like my life, I've been really inspired by and trying to think how I could, because it's the writing itself, both of them are very good writers, and I love just like line for line, I love reading their writing, especially Lynn Heginian stuff. But the structure, when you kind of stand back and you get a little bit dizzy trying to fit it all into place. So I find that really interesting, and I think it would be an interesting challenge for me. In addition to Louis Trondheim's exhortation to do something with no constraint and do like a straightforward story, to push a bit further into more experimental work as well in the future.
Can't wait to see what comes next. I promise I'll make another trip down to Philadelphia, provided you're still here and haven't, uprooted and gone
we're here for good. I think we're staying.
Awesome. Matt, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. And
thanks for coming down to see me.
I really love the book, too.
Thank you.
And that was Matt Madden. Go get 6 Treasures of the Spiral, comics formed under pressure from Uncivilized Books. Matt really does some amazing comics, and the haiku in there are they're special too, as a guy who puts out a zine called Haiku for Business Travelers, blah, blah, blah. And like you said, everybody loves short stories. Everything in there is digestible as a short story in and of itself. You don't have to read the entire collection at once. You don't have to know what all the challenges and formal constraints are, but afterwards it sort of helps to better appreciate what you've been reading. Anyway, you can find out more about Matt and his work at mattmadden.com, mattmadden.com, all one word. He's on Instagram at mmaddencomics, all one word. And his YouTube channel is just a string of letters and numbers. So I'll have a link to that and all the other links in the show and episode notes for this one. Oh, and you should check out his Substack, which is mattmad, mattmadd.substack.com. Thanks for listening to the Virtual Memories Show. You can support this podcast by telling other people about it. There's no better way to build an audience than through word of mouth. Also, visit Apple's podcast page for us and leave a rating and review. Every little bit helps, You can also support the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it and who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or comic or theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me a postcard, letter, email, DM if we're connected on Instagram or Blue Sky, or by leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. Messages can be up to 3 minutes long. It'll cut you off after that, so call back and leave another message if you do. And let me know if it'd be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to share with our listeners, but I'd never run someone's message without their permission, so let me know. Now, if you've got money to spare, I appreciate it, but don't give it to me. I've got a day job that pays the bills. You should give to individuals and institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Crowdfunder, Indiegogo, all those crowdfunding platforms where you'll find people who really need help just trying to make ends meet or get an artistic project going, covering medical bills or car payments or veterinary bills, and just a few dollars from you might make a real difference in their lives. Now, when it comes to institutions, I give to my local food bank and World Central Kitchen every month, but there are a lot of other things you can give to the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, Election Funds, Planned Parenthood, and Women's Choice. There's a lot of things you can do with your money to try to help build a better world, so I hope you'll give. Now, our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You can visit my archives at vmspod.com to check out my 2018 conversation with Hal, where you can learn more about his art, his music, and more. And you can follow Hal on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. That's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download all our past episodes at Apple Podcasts and other podcast sources. And you can find all my episodes and sign up for the Virtual Memories Show newsletter at vmspod.com. And I'm also on Blue Sky and Instagram and YouTube as vmspod. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.